Hi there, and welcome back to 19th century art. In this lecture, we're going to examine the picturesque and the sublime, the role of landscape art in Britain early in the 19th century. To begin with, I want to start by looking at the treatment of landscape in neoclassical art. In the Baroque period and the Rococo period, landscape is a tool for framing the figures. It is there to organize the space so that the figures have more specific relationships to each other. By itself, the landscape does not speak or have a voice. It's not there to lend any further meaning to the composition. And so the landscape plays a very passive role in the art of this early period. Beginning in the 19th century, there was a closer attention to landscape, but still there would be an occasional tree or plant that had certain symbolic meaning, but overall, people didn't draw from nature, they didn't copy nature. They didn't go out and look at nature as a form of art in itself. The landscape was made of bits and pieces of natural elements, sort of cobbled together to lend variety and texture to the painting. In a similar way, gardens were very structured. Gardens removed the nature from nature. People wanted these very crisp, clean lines and shaped and organized spaces. And that's because nature was otherwise chaotic and disorderly, and it was important for art to be shaped and to be given meaning by human necessity. There was a desire to overrule the unruly and the chaotic in nature. This begins to change in the early 18th century. We have this idea of the picturesque. And this means that people began to examine the landscape through really a very different lens. It became a fashion when traveling to carry this object, which was a darkened mirror, that allowed people to look at their surroundings indirectly by seeing them reflected in the clawed glass. They would see them more unified, more beautified. They became more uniquely artistic, and this was the picturesque. The carrying a clawed glass was like having a portable painting in your pocket. It would transform any jumble of trees and rocks into a vision of painterly charm, framed and set apart from the rest of the landscape. The color palette would be simple, bathed in a gentle, hazy light. And so this aesthetic sense of the natural world, that the natural world had in it this aesthetic virtue, the picturesque, a little bit more wild, a little bit more untamed, but brought together aesthetically through the dimming of its individual parts and unifying it through this dark reflection, the clawed glass. So the clawed glass was a slightly convex blackened mirror carried in the hand, held up to the eye, and the image was seen, the scenery behind, rather in front of you. So rather than directly looking at the landscape in front of you and saying, "Oh, how beautiful," people would literally turn their backs to what they wanted to see and reflect it in the mirror. Now, if you want to have an idea how to use a clawed glass today, just simply turn off your phone and reflect the landscape around you through its darkened surface. Landscapes were changing in many ways, and the people's relationship to the landscape was profoundly changing. A number of things have been happening over the last centuries that really came to a head in the 19th century. First of all was the Enclosure Acts. For the feudal period, all throughout the medieval and Renaissance times, there were lands that were shared by the peasants. They didn't belong to anybody in particular. They were where the peasants could grow foods for themselves, and they were communally tended for and cared for. There was a kind of collective sense of ownership. And it's over time, these collective plots would be enclosed, literally fenced off, and claimed as private property of the feudal lord who claimed to own the land all around. And they would say, this is my land now, and if you want to farm it, you have to work for me and to gain that. So I will pay you a salary. And rather than you earning your keep by growing your own food, you would be growing my food, and then I would be paying you for it. So enclosure really diminished the economic viability of being a peasant. And a lot of people found themselves starving and out of work in the countryside and needing to move to the cities. So there's this huge migration to the cities during this time. The railroad exacerbated this. Again, the economy shifted, local manufacture disappeared, and cities became these massive centers of major industrial strength. And then lastly, there was the Irish famine, where a potato blight destroyed the crops in Ireland. And because of agricultural mismanagement, exacerbated this problem. They had this monoculture. Everyone was growing potatoes for the feudal lords, that the economy collapsed. And during 1854 to 1852, about 1 million people died, and 1 million more people fled Ireland. This really shifted the populations out of the rural areas and this enormous growth in the cities. There was a great deal of strife and protest during the early industrial period as mill owners began to monopolize the tools of the industry. They began to have more control over wages, and as the mechanization increased, the mill owners decided to hire less and less skilled people and pay them less for working these machines. And so in protest for the de-skilling of their jobs and for the lack of compensation they were receiving for the work they did, there were many people who rose up in protest. The most famous of this time were the Luddite rebellions, who championed a fictional character, Ned Ludd, who was the leader of this movement. Here you see a letter that would be written to mill owner, threatening the destruction of their tools if they didn't properly compensate the people who were working there. And they always signed these threatening letters with the name Ned Ludd. And so one of the ways in which they were sort of threatening these mill owners is that you either pay us properly or we will sneak in at night and destroy your machinery, which was extremely expensive and very difficult to replace. And so machine smashing became a plague of a problem across the countryside in Britain as mill owners refused to pay a living wage, and the skilled workers of the countryside took up arms and fought against their livelihood. They were starving. And the government was in disarray and did not sympathize with the common people. The royalty were terrified of a French Revolution, so they brutally oppressed the workers who revolted in the Luddite rebellions. And in 1818, many of those who were caught and convicted of protesting would be executed or sent off to Australia. So in this time, landscape was a very powerful and fraught space. The land was changing, and so the landscape becomes a place of remembrance of the past, a peaceful past, a past in the time long ago when it was the source of identity, when people felt they knew where they lived and there was a kind of order to society. The first major landscape artist to emerge was Joseph Mallord William Turner, who was a middle-class artist who began doing a number of landscapes in watercolor that were truly spectacular. He found this travel to exotic places. He was trying to bring the land into a dialogue with our current situation. And he uses the landscape as a kind of character that expresses the challenges of what it means to be human. Turner traveled across Europe, the youngest member of the Royal Academy at age 15. He never married, but he did have 2 daughters from his housekeeper. He was a fairly private man, and his paintings were really his sole life of expression. Here we see his painting of the Devil's Bridge, a watercolor on paper. This is a really dramatic chasm that can be found in the French Alps. And again, he brings the drama of this bridge into focus with the waterfall plunging through and the rising cliffs with the steam all around. And this sense of vertigo that he brings to the picture is very dramatic and unsettling. Turner uses, as I said, the landscape as a means to convey the drama of the day. And so here he's created a painting of a snowstorm with Hannibal crossing the Alps. Now remember, it was Napoleon who crossed the Alps, just like Hannibal. So by Turner making a painting of Hannibal crossing the Alps, he's referring to Napoleon's new adventure without actually directly referring to Napoleon. And if you look powerfully into this swirling storm, the shapes are really spectacular and dramatic. There's a tiny silhouette of an elephant far in the background, which is really diminishes the human scale and really exaggerates the movement of the atmosphere. And that's what Turner was really great at, is bringing this kind of swirling, majestic forces of nature into his paintings. So landscape painting was, for most parts, a rather sedate thing. And what Turner does is he brings this idea of the history painting, the kind of drama and scale of the history painting, the great beauty of history painting, and he makes landscape the subject of his history painting. Here is another incident that came about, the burning of the House of Lords, consumed the House of Lords, and he did a whole series of paintings in this dramatic way. We see the flames growing and shooting up in the sort of swirling lights across the Thames. This is, again, a way in which he brings this moment to life with this power of the elements. Turner also took on the abolition by showing the violence of the slavers who would throw their human cargo overboard when they realized they couldn't make any money in their trade anymore. And so you see the sharks devouring the people, pleading for life in the swirling waters. This is a really powerful and disturbing image. And the violence that we see in the churning waters is reflected in the swirling and burning sky. Turner also did this wonderful atmospheric effects and this very wonderful image of the train coming out of the mists across this bridge. He allows us to see the emergence of the railroad. And as I mentioned before, the railroad was a huge transformative thing that was coming and unifying the country in a very dramatic way. It was a harbinger of the future. And Turner tries to represent this idea of this coming force of technology through the emergence of the train through the mists. Another painting he created, which also talks about this idea of technology and the transformation of history. We see a steamboat pulling the fighting Tamerlane, tugged to her last berth to be broken up. So the fighting Tamerlane was a very important warship. It was a part of the history of naval supremacy that Britain enjoyed during the war with Napoleon. And here, this great warship, this famed warship, has been superseded now and is obsolete and is being broken up into scrap. And so there's a sense of loss and longing. And I think this is a really important characteristic of landscape, that there is with these transformations a loss of innocence. The past is being consumed by the present. And this steamboat represents this transformation into the modern world. Now, Turner spent a great deal of time on the atmospheric effects of his paintings. And this was one of my favorite paintings I saw in this massive exhibition of Turner's many years ago in Washington, D.C. And this one has this really funny title, Sunrise with Sea Monsters. It's generally regarded as an unfinished painting, but in its unfinished state, we can really see what he really was focused on, which was this passionate, swirling way in which the sky is consumed by light and steam and smoke. And then later on, he began to sort of fill out all the other more realistic details until some arbitrary moment he decided he was to finish and would walk away. In this case, in its unfinished state, there's sort of this murky looking face toward the center of the canvas. And if you look at it a certain way, it might be a sea monster, or it could just be a pair of fish that are lying on the beach. In any case, it's a curious image that in its unrealized state, we see Turner's passion for the air and light. One of the most important landscape artists following Turner was the man John Constable, who, while he did not have a whole lot of success during his lifetime, he had an extraordinary influence later on and throughout Europe, and he now is one of the most beloved landscape artists in Britain. His work is far more realistic. He takes the mundane, the prosaic, the everyday life in the country, and he gives it this very finely realized existence. It's evocative. We get a real sense of place, a real sense of light, a real sense of time of day. All of these things which have become common icons of landscape painting since then. He's really the one that anchors landscape in a realistic mode. Whereas Turner could be evocative and sublime and exaggerate those qualities of the supernatural in the landscape, Constable really wanted to find the beauty in the everyday. Like Turner, they both employed watercolor quite a bit. Watercolor was a new art medium that allowed artists to carry a pocket painting set out into the countryside and paint quickly color notes and observed nature directly. And a lot of what they were able to achieve in the studio later was from these rather swiftly realized, vibrant sketches of clouds and light across real natural forms. And that is what makes them so remarkable, is they're really observing nature as it exists in the wild. Here is probably one of Constable's most famous paintings, the Haywain. It's a country setting. We see a cart in midstream, and we see the clouds billowing in the background. There's a dog along the shore. There's a man in the cart. It's all very mundane and ordinary, but it also suggests that it has some poetic quality of light, that people find a certain familiarity and beauty in the simple way it is expressing those obvious truths. Now, in Britain, people really didn't think much of this. It was like, oh, an ordinary landscape. It looks just like it looks. But when Constable went to Paris and showed his work, people were truly stunned. Because at this time, with the neoclassical style being ascendant, people were not really looking realistically at the world around them. And it was this kind of art that stunned them because it was so frank and so simple and so direct. One of the ways in which Constable worked was he had all these small watercolors that he drew inspiration from, and from them he would try and create very quickly an initial value study. He didn't worry about all the colors. He was just trying to get the lights and darks correct. And so in his initial value study, which was almost done to scale, just a little bit smaller, he would try and capture the values, not the greens and the blues, but just how light and how dark, so that the composition was really well ordered. And then once he had that figured out, he would again go in and add the colors to those values in a new painting that would express the sort of organization and careful study of his initial value study. John Constable had a difficult end of life. His wife died in 1828 at age 41, and he sank into a deep depression. In this period, his landscapes no longer have the kind of unity and elegance and common beauty. Instead, he focuses on ruins and craggy rocks. This, one of his last works, the Hadie Castle, is one of his 6-foot masterpieces, which shows the distress and turmoil of his later work. Constable's interest in ruins was picked up by many other romantic landscape artists. It powerfully evokes the idea of loss and the hubris of the idea of permanence. There are, of course, lots of ruins to record in Europe, which has such an extraordinary history all about it. In the United States, when ruins became a fashion, people constructed these fanciful ruins for their gardens